For almost 6 years, my wife asked me the exact same question every spring. Can we finally cut down that tree? She never argued, never raised her voice. She'd simply ask, then move on as if the answer didn't matter, but it always did. At first I blamed the leaves. Every fall they covered the entire backyard. Then I blamed the shade. The oak blocked the afternoon sun from reaching our patio. Later I blamed the roots after they cracked part of the stone walkway. Every year I found another excuse to leave it alone. The tree wasn't sick. It wasn't dangerous. If anything, it was the most beautiful thing on our property. A massive white oak that looked older than every house on the street, maybe older than the neighborhood itself. Everything changed the week our 82-year-old neighbor died. After his memorial service, his daughter walked over carrying a small wooden box. "My father wanted you to have this." I frowned. "Me?" She nodded. "He said if the oak was still standing when he died, you deserved to know the truth." My name is Ethan Walker. 6 years earlier, my wife Claire and I had bought a quiet brick house in Asheville, North Carolina. The realtor spent the entire showing talking about the schools, the parks, and the low crime rate. I barely heard a word she said. The moment I stepped into the backyard, I saw the oak. Its trunk was so wide, I couldn't wrap my arms halfway around it. An old wooden swing still hung from one of the branches, faded by decades of rain and sunlight. "It feels like it's always been here," I said. The realtor smiled. "According to county records, it probably has." I looked at Claire. "What do you think?" She stared at the tree for a few seconds. "It's bigger than I expected." That was all she said. Looking back, I think she already disliked it. Our closest neighbor was Thomas Harris. Everyone called him Tom. He was a retired land surveyor, a Vietnam veteran, and one of those people who seemed to know every family on the street. About 3 weeks after we moved in, I was unloading a new chainsaw from my truck to trim a few branches. Tom crossed the street before I could even start. "Morning, Ethan." "Morning." His eyes moved from the chainsaw to the oak. "You can trim the branches," he said, "but don't ever cut that tree down." I laughed. I wasn't planning to. He kept looking at me. "I'm serious." There was something about the way he said it. Not fear, not anger, absolute certainty. "I promise." Only then did he smile. "Good." He tipped his cap and slowly walked back home. I figured he was just sentimental about an old tree. Claire wasn't. "What was that about?" she asked. "He likes the oak." "Well, I don't." That was the first time she asked me to remove it. The next spring she asked again. Then the spring after that. Always the same question. "Can we finally cut down the oak?" Whenever I asked why, the answer changed. "It blocks too much light. The roots will damage the foundation. The leaves are impossible to clean. I read old trees become dangerous." Every explanation sounded reasonable, until she'd give me a completely different one a year later. Eventually I hired an arborist just to settle the argument. He spent 20 minutes examining the tree before smiling. "This is one of the healthiest white oaks I've seen, so it doesn't need to come down." He almost laughed. "Absolutely not. If anything, this tree adds value to your property." Then he estimated its age. "Somewhere around 170 years. I blinked. "The neighborhood isn't that old." "No," he replied. "The tree is." When Claire got home, I told her everything. She listened quietly, then asked only one question. Did he say what it would cost to remove it anyway? For the first time, I wondered if the tree itself wasn't the real reason she wanted it gone. A few months later, Tom passed away peacefully in his sleep. The entire neighborhood attended the memorial. As people began leaving, his daughter stopped me near the parking lot. We'd only met once before. She was holding the same small wooden box. "Dad made me promise to give you this." She placed it in my hands. "He said if someone finally refused to cut down the oak, that person deserved to know why." I thanked her, carried the box home, and placed it on our dining room table. Claire looked at it for a long moment. "What is it?" "Tom left it for me." She stepped closer. "You should open it." I picked up the small brass key resting on top, unlocked the box, and slowly lifted the lid. There wasn't money. There weren't family heirlooms. Inside were old survey maps, black and white photographs, newspaper clippings, and dozens of carefully labeled envelopes. Lying on top of everything else was a single sealed letter. Across the front, written in blue ink, were 6 words: "For whoever owns the oak last." The handwriting was neat, almost painfully deliberate, like someone had taken their time knowing these words might not be read for years. I unfolded the letter and began reading. "If you're holding this, Tom has probably passed away. That means the responsibility now belongs to you. Before you decide what to do with the oak, I need you to understand why it has survived for so long." There was no signature, just those words. I looked through the rest of the box. Every envelope had a year written on the front, starting in the late 1960s. The photographs showed the same oak from different decades. Some were black and white, others faded with age, but the tree always stood in exactly the same place, while everything around it slowly changed. New houses appeared. Roads were paved. Children grew into adults. The oak never moved. Claire stood beside me, quietly watching. "What's in the other envelopes?" "I don't know yet." She reached toward the box, then stopped herself. "Maybe it's just an old family project." "I don't think so." I held up one of the survey maps. Every property line on our street had been carefully marked in red ink. Only one thing was circled: the oak. Not our house, not Tom's, just the tree. The next morning I skipped work and started going through the documents one by one. The oldest map dated back to 1954. According to the notes, several developers had wanted to clear the entire neighborhood for new construction, but one section had been marked "Protected, pending survey." The protected section wasn't a house. It wasn't a road. It was the land surrounding the oak. A newspaper clipping from 1971 described a highway expansion that would have removed dozens of mature trees. Somehow, the route had been changed at the last minute. Again, the oak remained untouched. By lunchtime, I wasn't asking why Claire wanted to remove it. I was asking why so many people had spent decades making sure nobody ever could. That afternoon, I walked across the street to thank Tom's daughter again. Her name was Melissa, and she was sorting through boxes inside her father's garage. "I'm sorry to bother you." "You aren't." She smiled sadly. "I figured you'd have questions." "I have a lot." She nodded toward an old workbench. "Dad expected that." I told her about the letter and the maps. She didn't seem surprised. "He spent years putting that box together." "For me? No. For whoever owned the oak after him." I frowned. "So he always planned to give it away." "He used to say the tree never belonged to one person." Melissa opened a drawer and handed me a worn leather notebook. This wasn't in the box because Dad kept reading it. The cover had no title. Inside were dozens of handwritten entries stretching back nearly 40 years. Most were only a few lines long. "Checked the roots after the storm. No damage. Survey markers still intact. Another offer from the developer. Said no again. New family moved into the Walker house. They seemed like good people." I stopped reading. "Wait." I looked at Melissa. "He wrote about us?" She smiled. "He noticed everyone." Then her expression became more serious. "But once you get closer to the end, that's when everything changes." That evening I sat on the back porch while the sun disappeared behind the oak. The backyard was completely quiet except for leaves moving in the breeze. I opened the notebook where Melissa had placed a bookmark. The entries had become longer, more personal. One in particular caught my attention. "Claire asked Ethan to cut down the tree again today. She isn't the first person who's wanted it gone, but she's the first who keeps asking without knowing why she's asking. I don't think she realizes she's repeating someone else's fear." I read the sentence twice, then a third time. Someone else's fear. What was that supposed to mean? I looked toward the house where Claire was making dinner, then back at the notebook in my hands. For the first time since opening Tom's box, I had the uncomfortable feeling that this story wasn't really about an old tree. It was about something that had been quietly passed from one generation to the next, and somehow my family had just become part of it. My wife kept begging me to cut down one tree in our backyard. After my neighbor died, I finally learned why nobody ever did. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about one sentence from Tom's journal. She's the first who keeps asking without knowing why she's asking. It didn't make any sense. Claire wasn't hiding anything from me. We'd been married for 12 years. If there was a reason she hated the oak, she would have told me, wouldn't she? The next morning I asked her again, "Can I ask you something?" She looked up from her coffee. "Sure. Why do you really want the tree gone?" She sighed, clearly expecting the conversation. "I've already told you." "No, you've given me different reasons every year." She frowned. "What do you mean?" I started counting on my fingers. First it was the leaves, then the roots, then the shade, then safety. She didn't answer. "You've never given me the same reason twice." For a few seconds she simply stared at me. Finally, she shrugged. "I don't know. I just don't like it." It was the first honest answer she'd ever given, and somehow it unsettled me more than any excuse she'd used before. That afternoon I went back to Tom's notebook. The later entries felt less like observations and more like warnings. One page had been underlined twice. People always think they're making their own decision. Most of the time, they aren't. The next page mentioned a couple who had owned our house almost 20 years earlier. The wife wanted the oak removed within 6 months of moving in. She couldn't explain why. Eventually, she stopped asking. I turned another page. Different family. Same story. Another wife. Another request. Another unexplained dislike for the tree. It had happened again and again and again. Not every homeowner. Just enough to notice a pattern. The following day, I decided to visit the county archives. If Tom had spent decades protecting the oak, there had to be a reason beyond nostalgia. An employee helped me pull the oldest property records available. Most were exactly what I'd expected. Land transfers, tax documents, survey maps. Then she handed me a thin folder that had been stored separately. "This one's unusual," she said. "It isn't requested very often." Inside was a preservation report from the early 1980s. The first page explained that local historians wanted to register the oak as a protected landmark. The second page caught my attention. Recommendation delayed pending review of supporting historical evidence. Supporting historical evidence? What evidence? I flipped through the rest of the folder. Nothing. The report ended there. Several pages had clearly been removed years earlier. Before leaving, I asked the archivist if she knew anything about the missing documents. She smiled apologetically. "Only what everyone around here has heard." "And what's that?" "That an old surveyor refused to let anyone touch the tree." "Tom?" She nodded. "He used to come here all the time." "What was he looking for?" "No idea. But every visit ended the same way." "How?" "He'd smile, thank us for our help, and tell us the tree wasn't important." She laughed softly, which usually meant it was. That evening, Melissa called. I found another box while cleaning Dad's attic. "More journals?" "No. Photographs." She drove over an hour later carrying a faded envelope. Most of the pictures showed neighborhood gatherings from decades ago. Barbecues, block parties, children playing beneath the oak. Then one photograph stopped me. It showed Tom standing beside another man I didn't recognize. Both were much younger. They were holding surveying equipment, and behind them stood the oak exactly where it is today. Written on the back was a single sentence. "Some things aren't meant to be owned, only protected." I turned the photo over again. No names, no date, nothing else. Melissa watched my expression. "Dad kept that picture on his desk for years. Did he ever tell you who the other man was?" She slowly shook her head. "Only that he made him a promise." "A promise?" "That as long as either of them was alive, the oak would never be cut down." I looked through the window toward the backyard. For 6 years I'd believed the tree was just an old part of the property. Now it felt like something else entirely. Not because of what it was, but because of how many people had quietly dedicated part of their lives to protecting it without ever explaining why. The more I learned about Tom, the less I believed he had simply been an old man who loved a tree. He'd spent decades documenting it, protecting it, and planning for the day someone else would take over. Nobody does that without a reason. The only problem was, I still didn't know what that reason was. A few days later, Melissa called. I found something else. What is it? I'm not sure. Dad hid it behind a false panel in his workshop. An hour later, we were standing in Tom's garage while she slid a narrow wooden board aside, revealing a hidden compartment inside the wall. Tucked inside was a weathered metal tube sealed with old wax. Melissa carefully handed it to me. I think he wanted you to find this last. Inside was a hand-drawn survey map, unlike any I'd seen before. It showed only a small section of the neighborhood. The oak stood directly in the center. Around it, someone had drawn a perfect circle with a radius of about 50 feet. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten note. Everything inside this boundary must remain untouched. No explanation, no signature, nothing else. That evening, Claire watched me spread the map across the dining table. You've been thinking about this non-stop. I know. Tom's gone, Ethan. You don't have to solve every mystery he left behind. I looked at her. What if he spent 50 years protecting something important? She smiled. Then maybe he also believed someone would eventually figure it out. For the first time since all this began, she didn't ask me to cut down the oak. Instead, she sat beside me studying the old survey. Whatever this is, she said quietly, I hope it's worth everything Tom gave up to protect it. The next morning, I visited the local historical society. An elderly volunteer named Margaret recognized the photograph almost immediately. I haven't seen this picture in years. You know the man standing next to Tom? She nodded. His name was Walter Brooks. He was the county historian. She pointed toward the oak in the photo. The two of them spent years trying to preserve that tree. Why? Margaret disappeared into a storage room and returned carrying an old leather binder. This never made it into the public archives. Inside were letters exchanged between Walter and Tom over nearly 20 years. Most discussed land records and surveys, but one sentence had been underlined in red ink. If the oak disappears, the last physical witness disappears with it. I looked up. Witness to what? Margaret slowly shook her head. That's the question Tom spent most of his life trying to answer. On the drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about those words. The last physical witness. Not a marker, not a monument, a witness. That meant the tree had actually been there when something happened. Something important enough that two ordinary men had quietly devoted decades of their lives to protecting it. When I pulled into the driveway, I found Claire sitting beneath the oak with a cup of tea. She looked up as I walked over and smiled. You know, I think I finally understand why you never wanted to cut it down. I sat beside her. What changed? She rested one hand against the rough bark. I stopped seeing it as an old tree. She looked up through the branches. Now I think it's the last living thing that remembers whatever everyone else forgot. I didn't answer. For the first time since Tom's funeral, it felt like we weren't chasing an old mystery anymore. We were getting dangerously close to the truth. When I walked inside, I noticed the wooden box still sitting on the dining room table. I'd gone through almost everything inside it. Almost. One envelope remained unopened. Unlike the others, it didn't have a date. It simply read, "Open only after you understand why the tree matters." I laughed quietly. I guess I don't qualify yet. Claire smiled. Maybe that's the point. The next afternoon, Melissa called again. I found one more thing. I thought we'd already emptied the house. So did I. She sounded excited. I found a key taped underneath Dad's old desk. An hour later, I was back in Tom's garage. The key was old brass, worn smooth from decades of use. Attached to it was a faded paper tag. Safety Deposit Box 214. Dad never mentioned a bank, I asked. Melissa shook her head. Never. We drove there together. The manager checked the records before disappearing into the vault. A few minutes later, he returned carrying a narrow metal box. According to the paperwork, Tom had rented it continuously for 37 years. Inside were only 3 items: a folded letter, a cassette tape, and a small leather notebook. Nothing else. The letter was addressed to Tom. It had been written by Walter Brooks. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, And you're probably wondering if all these years were worth it. Tom had underlined one sentence in blue ink. The tree was never the secret. It was the proof. I read that line several times. Proof of what? The notebook answered part of the question. Walter had spent years interviewing elderly residents who remembered the neighborhood before any houses existed. Their stories were remarkably similar. Every one of them mentioned the oak. Not because it was unusual, but because important meetings had taken place beneath it for generations. Families settled property disputes there. Soldiers returning from war gathered there before going home. During the Great Depression, neighbors shared food beneath its branches. The tree had quietly witnessed the history of an entire community. It wasn't famous. It wasn't sacred. It was simply the one place everyone trusted. The cassette tape took longer. Melissa found an old player in Tom's attic, and we listened together that evening. After several seconds of static, Walter's voice filled the room. Old, calm, deliberate. If you're hearing this, Tom, then you've probably outlived me, he chuckled softly. I hope the oak is still standing. He went on to explain that historians had searched for decades for physical evidence connecting many of the town's earliest settlements. Documents had been lost, buildings had burned, property records had disappeared, but the oak remained exactly where every old survey, diary, and hand-drawn map said it should be. It wasn't valuable because of what lay beneath it. It was valuable because it proved the stories had happened exactly where people claimed they had. Without the tree, those stories would become almost impossible to verify. On the drive home, everything finally clicked. Tom hadn't spent half his life protecting a tree. He'd been protecting the last piece of living evidence connecting the modern town to the people who built it. When I pulled into the driveway, Claire was already waiting on the porch. Did you find your answer? I looked toward the oak. Its branches stretched across the backyard just as they had for nearly 2 centuries. I think Tom was wrong about one thing. She smiled. What? He kept saying someone had to protect the tree. I shook my head. The truth is, the tree has been protecting this town's history all along. For the first time since we bought the house, Claire walked across the yard without saying a word. She rested her hand against the trunk, smiled to herself, and quietly said, I can't believe I ever wanted to cut you down. The following week, I contacted the county historical office and showed them everything Tom had collected over the years. At first, they were skeptical. Then they spent nearly 3 hours going through the maps, photographs, journals, and Walter's interviews. When they finished, one of the historians leaned back in his chair and smiled. I think your neighbor just solved a problem that's been confusing us for decades. Within a month, a team of surveyors, historians, and arborists visited the property. They measured the oak, compared its location with 19th century maps, and examined growth records dating back more than 100 years. Every document pointed to the same conclusion. The tree wasn't simply old. It was the last surviving landmark that connected the modern neighborhood to the original settlement. Every house around it had been rebuilt. Roads had moved. Property lines had changed. The oak was the only thing that had never left. 6 months later, the county officially designated it as a protected historical landmark. A small bronze plaque was placed near the base of the trunk. It didn't mention treasure. It didn't mention secret tunnels. It didn't even mention Tom. It simply explained that the oak had witnessed generations of local history and would be preserved for those who came after us. I stood there reading it with Claire. I wish Tom could have seen this, she said. So do I. Then I smiled. Although I have a feeling he expected it. A few days later, I finally opened the last envelope from the wooden box, the one Tom had marked. Open only after you understand why the tree matters. Inside was a single handwritten page. If you've opened this, then you finally understand what took me most of my life to learn. People always think history lives in museums, books, or photographs. Sometimes it does. But sometimes history is simply the one thing that refuses to disappear while everything around it changes. The oak was never ours. We were only the next people trusted to protect it. There was no dramatic ending, no hidden fortune, no shocking confession, Just one final lesson from a man who had quietly kept his promise for more than 50 years. That letter changed the way I looked at the backyard. I stopped seeing it as part of my property. Instead, it felt like I was borrowing it from the people who had cared for it long before I arrived. Claire felt the same way. Every spring, she'd once asked me to cut the tree down. Now she was the first to remind me when it needed another inspection, or when young branches needed support after a storm. Sometimes we'd find neighbors sitting beneath it on summer evenings, just talking while their children played nearby. Neither of us ever asked them to leave. In a strange way, it felt like the oak had quietly returned to doing what it had always done, bringing people together. Looking back, I realized Tom never wanted to leave me a mystery. He wanted to leave me a responsibility. The tree wasn't valuable because of what was hidden beneath it. It was valuable because it had survived long enough to remind people that some things deserve to outlive us. Every time I walk into the backyard, I still stop for a moment beneath those enormous branches. Not because I'm afraid someone might cut them down, but because I remember something Tom once told me on the day we met. You can trim the branches. He smiled before looking up at the oak. But don't ever cut that tree down. Back then, I thought he was talking about wood. Now I know he was talking about history.